Good evening. So how do we account for our stock option plan? What is the yearly compensation expense? What is the effect of the modification from 2014? And what would be the effect of having a performance condition? As your accountant, I will provide you with my recommendation and conclusions for the treatment of the plan based on FASB's Accounting Standards Codification System, Section 718. Moving on to the next slide. Let's talk about compensation expense. FASB requires us to recognize the grant date fair value of a stock option plan and expense it over the requisite service period. In our case, the grant date fair value was $15,000 and the requisite service period is 4 years. Assuming that there were no modifications and no performance conditions, the yearly compensation charges would be simply the $15,000 fair value divided by the 4 years, leading us to 4 equal yearly compensation expense charges of $3,750. Moving on to the next slide. Now, because we modified our option plan in January of 2014, the accounting changes. FASB treats modified options as a new set of options that is exchanged for the original options. And we are required to recognize any increase in the fair value of the modified options. The increase is measured by the difference between the fair value of the options upon modification and the fair value of the options immediately before modification. In our case, the additional fair value is $3,000 and we must expense this $3,000. Now, the way to do that is by adding it to the unamortized compensation expense at the time of modification. In our case, the unamortized portion of the compensation expense was $7,500 at January of 2014. Once we add the $3,000 additional fair value of the option plan, we have a total of $10,500 of unamortized compensation expense. Now, we are required by FASB to amortize this total sum over the remaining service period of the option plan, 2 years in our case. So our compensation expense charges for 2014 and 2015 would be $5,250 accordingly. Moving on to slide number 4. Now, what if we had waited until the options had already vested before we modified the terms? Now, in that case, FASB would still require us to recognize any increase in the fair value of the modified options. However, this additional fair value or additional cost would be expensed in the same period as the modification. The modified options would still be treated as a new set of options that was exchanged for the original set of options, but the modified options are treated as vesting immediately upon modification. Moving on to the next slide. Now, what if we had a performance condition for the vesting of the option plan? Now, compensation expense is directly related to the probability of the outcome of the performance condition. FASB specifies that compensation expense should be accrued only if it is probable that a performance condition will be achieved. So if we had a performance condition in our case that was considered improbable of achievement by December 31st of 2013, there would be no compensation expense for the year 2013. Now, the rationale for that treatment is that we wouldn't expect the options to vest, so there would be no related compensation expense. The cumulative expense at that point would still be $3,750 based on the accrual for 2012. There would just be no accrual for 2013. Now, FASB also requires us to go back and reassess the probability of achievement for the performance condition every reporting period. If and when it becomes probable again that the performance condition will be achieved, then we must once again accrue compensation expense in relation to it. If the performance condition is never satisfied, then we actually reverse any compensation expense related to that performance condition and that option plan. Moving on to the next slide. So in conclusion, the compensation expense related to a stock option plan depends on the grant date fair value, any modifications to the plan, performance conditions, the service period, and the expectation as to how many options will eventually vest. In our case, the modification done in 2014 led us to recognize an additional $3,000 in compensation expense, giving us a total charge of $5,250 for the years 2014 and 2015. And if we implement a performance condition, we would have a zero compensation expense for the year 2013 if it is considered improbable of achievement at that time, and our cumulative expense at that point would be based on the accrual that was done for the year 2012. Now, my recommendation is to follow the FASB guidelines from section 718 very closely. I will now be glad to answer any questions. And thank you for listening.